Hello, and welcome to this lecture entitled The Southern Homefront in World War I. Let me get this war started before jumping into stories about the home front. World War I has its roots in the late 1800s. Prussia humiliated France in the Franco-Prussian War of 1871, and in 1882, this new German empire allied with the Austro-Hungarian Empire and Italy. These are the teal-colored countries on the map. This treaty was renewed for 6 years in 1908, though neither Germany nor Austria thought Italy would remain loyal when trouble came. On the other hand, in 1904, England and France negotiated an end to their colonial differences and entered the Entente Cordiale. Then in 1907, England and Russia negotiated their colonial differences and created the Triple Entente, which are the purple countries on this map. When war broke out in August of 1914, Italy refused to enter the war, and it switched sides in May of 1915. The Ottoman Empire joined Germany and Austria in October of 1914, and Bulgaria joined the Central Powers in October of 1915. Everyone knows how the Great War began. In late June 1914, Austrian Archduke and heir to the throne Franz Ferdinand, with wife Sophie, visited Sarajevo, Bosnia's capital. There, Serbian assassins attacked their motorcade with grenades. Franz Ferdinand insisted he wanted to visit the wounded, but took the medieval back streets where his limousine got stuck on a right-angle turn. The remaining assassins had retired to a cafe to pout, which happened to be at exactly that turn. Gavrilo Princips, 19 years old, jumped onto the car's running board and shot both. He later died in an Austrian prison at age 24. He had contracted tuberculosis of the bones and had had his arm amputated. By August 1st, 1914, the Great War had begun. By the time of the armistice on November 11th, 1918, 55 nations had declared war against each other, not all of them in Europe. The U.S. entered the war on April 6th, 1917. States had converted their militias into National Guard troops between 1903 and 1916, and some of these had been with the Mexican punitive expedition since October of 1916. Much of this lecture will use Alabama as an example, but states across the South had similar experiences. Alabama's first contribution to the war effort was military units. The Alabama National Guard was one of the groups that had been on the Mexican punitive expedition but had returned in February. They expected to be mustered out, but instead were federalized in April 1917. As they waited to recruit to full strength, units were sent for a few weeks to guard infrastructure in Alabama and Tennessee. They mustered into the regular army in August as the 167th Regiment, 42nd Rainbow Division, trained at Camp Mills, New York under Colonel William Screws. Screws had an unusual position. Most regiments changed commanders at least once, especially as the Army considered National Guard commanders to be substandard. But Bill Screws remained the CO of the 167th throughout its service in the American Expeditionary Force. The 167th trained at Camp Mills, New York, then deployed to France, where they fought the Battle of Croix Rouge Farm, Second Battle of the Marne, July 15th through 16th, 1918. The 167th was also on the line longer than any unit commanded by Americans, racking up a 110-day stint when units usually rotated out every 14 days. Now, the New York 369th Regiment, African-American troops under French command, served a full 6 months on the line without relief. Other Alabamians were assigned to the 31st or Dixie Division and spent much of the war at Camp Wheeler in Georgia. Deployed, but they were at Brest at the time of the armistice. Alabama draftees were inducted into different units. 4 men from Tallahassee, for example, were inducted into the 81st Division on May 24, 1914. The 81st suffered all of its 970 casualties in the last 2 days of the war. The 167th returned to Alabama in May 1919. Units paraded in Huntsville, Decatur, and Gadsden. Then the entire regiment paraded at Birmingham, Mobile, and Montgomery before being mustered out at Camp Shelby, Mississippi. This is typical of how returning units came home. The South received benefits from World War I, particularly from federal spending. One of the most important forms of that spending was the establishment of U.S. Army training camps, including air service stations, and the upgrade of existing camps and installations. Well, there were many camps in the Midwest and Northeast, the centers of population. The South found itself the recipient of many new and upgraded facilities. These southern camps were assigned not by the War Department directly, but by the general in charge of the newly created Southeastern Department of the Army, Leonard Wood. For Wood, this was a demotion and exile, but for the U.S. South, it was a godsend. Wood was a vociferous proponent of universal military training, so he was an easy touch for locating camps in the like-minded South. Additionally, the warmer weather allowed for year-round training. You can see from this map how the South enjoyed a line of camps south of about the 36th parallel. I'll use Alabama as an example of how camps affected the area where they were located. Alabama's 2 training camps were secured by Representatives Stanley Dent and Fred Blackman. I'll talk about one of these today, Camp Sheridan in Montgomery. It was named for the Union Cavalry Commander Phil Sheridan, which bothered many Montgomery residents. They got over it, though. It was built at Vanderveer Park, the former site of the Alabama State Fair and the assembly camp for the National Guard Unit, the 4th Alabama. Congressman Dent was not only responsible for securing Sheridan for Montgomery, but also for freezing out other sites that were making bids. In Alabama, those were the cities of Mobile and Birmingham. Montgomery and the Army signed the contract for the camp on June 25, 1917, and broke ground on July 23rd. The map on the slide shows the main part of Camp Sheridan, about 2 miles north of downtown Montgomery. The 37th Infantry Division arrived between late August and October 1917. The camp had room for 3,000 tents to accommodate the approximately 30,000 men from the area of Cleveland, Ohio. This was a significant boom for Montgomery, the population of which was 40,000. So this boom reduced the sting of the camp being named for a Yankee. Camp Sheridan's monthly payroll was $1.38 million. That's $25 million a month in 2017. And Montgomery boosters anticipated an annual income of $16 million, worth about $620 million in 2017 dollars. Sheridan also had what was called a remount depot that over the course of 2 years handled 17,300 horses and mules. It was staffed by 298 veterinary officers and enlisted men. There was also a rifle range 12 miles northeast of the camp and an artillery range 2 miles beyond that. There was a great deal of fraternization between the camp and the town, which was common, even where geography slowed it down. In Montgomery, townspeople welcomed the soldiers, and especially when the 37th and its successors arrived. Montgomery's civic elite made concerted efforts to entertain the soldiers in their homes and to make wholesome facilities available to them. As you can see in this slide, civilians provided missing infrastructure. Here, 2 women in the Motor Corps of the National League for Women's Service used a private car to ferry officers from one part of camp to another. They also drove men into town before sufficient trolley lines were open. Montgomery's all-out effort to be hospitable was largely because of its experience with the encampment of the 4th Alabama at the site, as it recruited to reach sufficient strength, about 3,000 men, to muster into the 42nd Division. In June of 1917, a special commission of the Army Medical Corps conducted a survey of one form of fraternization. It discovered that Montgomery enjoyed enough prostitutes to serve a city of 400,000. Remember, it was only 1/10 that size, and this was before the men of the 37th arrived. City leaders suppressed prostitution, and the 37th's commander was much more of a stickler than the 4th's about social hygiene. Regardless, fraternization led some soldiers to return to Montgomery and marry local women. Alabama has one famous story of fraternization. The 37th deployed to France in June 1918, and the 9th Infantry Division from Kansas replaced it. The 9th left Montgomery for Camp Mills, New York, to be deployed in November 1918, but turned around and came back with the armistice. The 9th had been mustered in at Camp Sheridan on July 18, 1918. It was mustered out at Camp Sheridan February 15, 1915. Our particular interest is in one of the lieutenants of the 67th Regiment of the 9th Division, F. Scott Fitzgerald. His training captain in Kansas, Dwight D. Eisenhower, reported that Fitzgerald was more interested in writing a novel than soldiering. On July 15th, 1918, 3 days before the 9th was mustered into federal service, Fitzgerald met the young daughter of an Alabama Supreme Court Justice, Zelda Sayre, and courted her over the next couple of years. Zelda was what was then called a free spirit, and soldiers flocked to her. She was about 18 in these pictures, taken only months before Fitzgerald met her. The picture on the right was from her high school yearbook. Fitzgerald's 1929 novella, Last of the Bells, recounts many instances in his Montgomery courtship with Zelda. Fitzgerald was one of those soldiers who came back to marry, but his was a tough row to hoe. Ultimately, he stalked Zelda and pestered her until she finally agreed to marry him. Fitzgerald's competition for Zelda's attention came from pilot cadets stationed at Montgomery's Taylor Field near Pike Road, the only air service station in Alabama. Taylor Field opened in April 1918 with over 100 airplanes, the Standard J, or J-1, mounted with Hall-Scott engines that had the annoying habit of bursting into flame for no apparent reason. When 2 pilots died because of engine fires, the commander replaced the J-1s with the Curtiss J-4Ns, the Jennies shown here. Taylor Field was paired with Repair Depot number 3 that was 2 miles west of downtown Montgomery. It was on the Alabama River at the site of the old Wright Brothers Flying School. This photo is of Governor Charles Henderson after he completed his first flight in an airplane there. His pilot is Ross L. Smith. Although Camp Sheridan was closed after the war, Repair Depot 3 survived the war and in 1922 became the hub of Maxwell Air Force Base today. Besides training camps and troops, the Great War benefited the South because of direct and contractual federal war spending. One example of this is Muscle Shoals, Alabama on the Tennessee River. 2 companies, Air Nitrates and Cyanamid, built plants to extract nitrate from the air, a process made feasible in Germany in 1913. This was to replace the nitrates mined in Chile and used in munitions manufacturing. They needed a great amount of electricity to work, so the federal government began constructing the Wilson Dam. It was not finished until 1922, and it became contentious when Henry Ford unsuccessfully pursued buying it. Electricity for the nitrate plants came from Alabama Power's coal-fired plant about 24 miles south. One of the problems associated with the influx of federal money in this kind of project was the migration of workers into the area that put a great strain on housing and the racial arrangements around the southern plant site. Another direct injection of federal money came from the U.S. Shipping Board Emergency Fleet Corporation that spent over $100 million to build merchant and some military ships in 36 ports around the entire nation. In March 1919, the EFC reported that it operated or contracted with 181 shipyards with 891 shipways. This was called the Emergency Fleet Corporation because the U.S. had long relied on European vessels to conduct its merchant shipping. When that shipping stayed home or was sunk by German U-boats in frighteningly large numbers, the U.S. government decided to build a merchant fleet from scratch. The South had yards that operated out of 17 or more ports from Hampton Roads, Virginia to Miami and from Key West to Galveston, Texas. To give you an idea about how this worked, let me talk about two ports, Milton, Florida and Mobile, Alabama. Milton is a small port about 20 miles upriver from Pensacola. A company there had contracts to build 3 Italian submarines, so it's not even counted in the Emergency Fleet Corporation numbers. Nevertheless, recruiting a workforce strained Milton so much that workers reported to Congress that they were living under brush arbors. Mobile had 5 large shipbuilding companies, 2 of which built housing for its workers. U.S. Steel, operating as the Chickasaw Shipbuilding Company, hired up to 6,000 workers and created the town of Chickasaw with 1,000 houses for black workers and 600 for whites. It had to lay in 12 shipways and even ran its own rail spur and utility company. Between May 1920 and September 1921, it finished 14 ships. Another company, the Alabama Dry Dock and Shipbuilding Company, already existed but expanded operations dramatically, as well as built housing for its workers. The 3 other large companies built facilities from scratch. They were close enough to Mobile that they just allowed their workers to live in town, which put tremendous strain on the housing stock and sent prices skyrocketing. This was aggravated by a fire in May of 1920 that destroyed 200 homes in the workers' neighborhoods close to the bay. No company completed a ship before the armistice, but EFC contracts extended into 1922, and Mobile hoped more contracts would continue indefinitely. Unfortunately, only repair work came in, so a few companies could continue. The federal government sold its contracted ships for pennies on the dollar, which was great for one Mobilian, John Waterman, who bought enough freighters to create what later became one of the largest shipping companies in the world. Southern civilians mobilized as the war progressed, usually by joining or working through organizations. Some of these we remember: the Red Cross, the WISE, Knights of Columbus and Jewish Servicemen's League, the 4-Minute Men and Women, probably the U.S. Food Administration, which was the starting point for Herbert Hoover's domestic political career and gave us meatless Mondays and wheatless Wednesdays, voluntary cutbacks rather than rationing. Others we have forgotten, some rightly so. Every state had a chapter of the Council for National Defense, a federal bureau created by President Wilson in 1916 to coordinate the war effort that was coming. At the federal level, the CND gave way to a plethora of other agencies like the War Industries Board, the U.S. Shipping Board, the U.S. Railroad Administration, and the Committee of Public Information. But the states retained both their chapters of the Council for National Defense and its adjunct, the Women's Committee of the Council of National Defense. At this point, there's not a great deal of scholarship on the state councils of defense or women's committees, so let me again use Alabama as an example. In one way, the U.S. organized its response to World War I according to the tenets of progressivism, but we cannot extend our current conception of bureaucracy backwards in time. The councils and committees, especially of government, tasked with running the war, had few precedents and little experience, and the war turned out to be a much bigger organizational challenge than anyone thought. So it should come as no surprise to learn that when Alabama Governor Charles Henderson appointed one leading person, that is a man, from each county to the state's Council of Defense, that they could not get themselves organized. It didn't help that a number of county appointees were actually dead. In Henderson's defense, he was working hastily off of an old list. In the summer of 1918, the Red Cross and other organizations took over the council and coordinated their efforts much more thoroughly. The Women's Committee had similar problems, but under the control of groups like the Daughters of the American Revolution, it did some good survey work about social conditions in the state. Other organizations were local or ad hoc groups formed for single purposes that dissolved after the war. The War Camp Community Service and the National Women's Committee are two examples. College women organized themselves into patriotic service leagues, while many of their male fellows enlisted en masse. Individuals did not have to join organizations to serve. They could help finance the war by buying Liberty bonds. The U.S. held 5 Liberty Bond drives that gave a quota of contributions to each state. Many southern states contributed more than their quotas. Liberty bonds were available to small donors too, who could make regular contributions of a dime, receive a stamp, and when they filled their contribution booklet, they redeemed it for a bond. Much of the excitement surrounding the war came from the propaganda arm of the government, the Committee of Public Information. Its job was to keep American morale and passions high, and it did so through the 4-minute lecturers, but also through an extensive poster campaign. By the end of the war, the CPI had produced over 1,500 distinct posters, placards, and buttons. Here are a few examples. The 4-Minute Men, the Red Cross, the YMCA, the 3rd Liberty Loan Drive, that was the big one, and my favorite, from the U.S. Food Administration, canned vegetables and the Kaiser too. Now, we cannot talk about Southern history in this era without speaking of race. African Americans contributed mightily to the war effort, often by acquiescing in their community leaders' requests that they demonstrate hyper-patriotism. Many white Southerners feared what we see here, armed and trained black men. In Alabama, some local elites wrote Governor Henderson to suggest that all blacks be drafted into home labor units subject to military discipline and used on farms and factories as needed. These units would be commanded by the letter writers, of course. This obvious violation of the 13th and 14th Amendments was exactly the argument that anti-draft Southern whites used in the spring of 1917 when they resisted induction. Southern blacks could not enlist in the regular army unless they were already in one of the few existing segregated National Guard units, but had to wait to be drafted. Proportionally, black draftees faced induction at much higher rates than whites. That is, draft boards did not excuse them as often as they did white men, even when blacks claimed the same exemptions from selective service. While there was a good deal of spoken resistance in the black community, like this is a white man's fight, so why should we get into it? White communities scrutinized their black neighbors for signs of disloyalty, which included leaving the area to find work in southern or northern cities. There emerged at the very beginning of the war a culture of repression of suspected differences, and in the South, racial lynchings were up. So African Americans had practical reasons for showing their support for the war. Another reason the African American community demonstrated hyperpatriotism was that leaders like Booker T. Washington's successor, Robert Russo Moton, and his chief aide, Emmett Scott, believed that a show of support would create a new social contract in the United States. Hyperpatriotism was supposed to turn the tide of prejudice and demonstrate that blacks were part of mainstream society. Thus, these men thought, whites would grant full citizenship to blacks. This not only did not work out, but President Wilson dispatched Moton and Scott to Europe to tell African American soldiers to not expect their status to change upon return. Social stagnation in the face of significant economic change led many rural Southerners to seize the opportunities offered by new industrial work to migrate first into southern cities and then into northern industrial centers. This exodus of labor from southern countryside is called the Great Migration. People often speak of the Great Migration as a topic in black history, but although African Americans migrated in larger proportions than whites, whites migrated in greater numbers. Nevertheless, both races migrated in significant enough numbers over enough years and took their attitudes with them that Southern social problems found their way to northern states and cities. This began earlier than World War I, but accelerated after 1910 and continued in waves into the 1970s. As conditions eased in the South but intensified in the North, many African Americans began moving back, but that is a different story. Farming was not a year-round activity, nor was industrial labor, so rural men and women could move back and forth as the work required. Industrial absenteeism was very high, as was turnover. Turnover was as much as 400% per year in steelmaking, for instance. Landless workers often worked on the farm for a season, then worked in a city-based industry. Often, especially black labor did not return, which became an issue. In World War I, Southern cities increasingly enforced their onerous vagrancy laws to ensure a labor supply for major landowners. And a good deal of propaganda and rumor claimed that German-associated labor agents lured naive black men from the South into industries in both Mexico and the North. Labor agents did recruit men and women, black and white, for industry, but they were not German agents. Southern municipalities suddenly passed ordinances requiring labor agents to have a license, some with fees as high as $500, or be prosecuted if caught. In one instance, a newspaper article described the verdict passed on 2 black labor agents. They were found not guilty. It was just a misunderstanding. Right next to an advertisement for white seamstresses to move from Montgomery, Alabama to South Carolina to sew coveralls for an Army contractor. On this map, you can see the general pattern of black migration. The adjustment of Southerners, regardless of race, to their new homes, and the adjustment of those new homes to the influx of Southerners is a significant story in itself. There's a significant amount of academic and popular scholarship on the Great Migration, including more than one documentary video. So in summary, the South fully participated in World War I in ways that were very similar to other regions of the country, but also in ways that reflected the South's still distinct identity. States contributed troops and organized themselves to prosecute this first total war in U.S. history. States also tried to accommodate the influx of large amounts of federal money that changed their economies, at least for a while, by adding new and profitable industries. Because southern states generally had poor infrastructures, such federal largesse caused disruptions that brought workers and their families from farm to city, then from southern city to northern ones in what we call the Great Migration. Finally, African Americans experienced the war differently from whites. Their loyalty was suspect and questioned, leading community leaders to call for hyper-patriotic displays. Indeed, some leaders thought such hyper-patriotism would convince Southern whites to rescind Jim Crow and recognize blacks as full citizens. This, of course, did not happen. This is the end of the lecture, and as always, thanks for your attention.